And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much. Not least of all because the monarchy is about.
Princess Anne stepped into the royal enclosure at Ascot at 8 o'clock this morning, holding a revised seating manifest printed on heavy cream cardstock. Her stride was brisk and purposeful as she walked past the main entrance barrier toward the central viewing pavilion. Her sudden action followed a high-level emergency conference at Windsor Castle, where King Charles formally granted her absolute authority over all royal enclosure protocols. With a single stroke of her pen, Anne struck the names of Camilla's family members from the master seating list, signaling an immediate and uncompromising purge of extended relatives from official state view. The Windsor Castle mandate, King Charles, sat at his partner's desk in the private monarch study at Windsor Castle. He held a heavy black fountain pen between his fingers. A single sheet of thick parchment paper lay flat on the green leather writing surface. Sunlight poured through the tall Gothic window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the quiet air. Princess Anne stood on the opposite side of the desk with her hands clasped behind her back. She wore a dark green tweed jacket and waited for the sovereign to finish signing his name at the bottom of the document. The facts are that executive authority over royal residences and enclosure privileges rests solely with the reigning sovereign under ancient royal prerogative powers. While traditional administrative duties are delegated to household departments and estate managers, the monarch retains the constitutional right to issue direct executive mandates altering access rules for state events, ceremonial viewings, and royal enclosures. When institutional stability requires immediate structural intervention, the sovereign can bypass standard bureaucratic committee reviews by issuing a royal sign manual directive. Tension filled the private study as the scratch of the fountain pen ceased against the paper. King Charles lifted the pen, set it down in its brass groove, and pushed the signed document across the leather desk toward his sister. He told Anne that the directive granted her full executive control over all royal enclosure seating charts and guest verification protocols starting immediately. He added that no exceptions would be made for any extended family member or non-working relative, regardless of personal rank or historical precedent. The facts were that the new executive mandate stripped the Lord Chamberlain's office of its traditional authority to issue courtesy guest passes for national celebrations and royal race meetings. For decades, extended family members and non-working relatives had enjoyed automatic access to prime viewing boxes based on social convention rather than constitutional duty. The signed directive formally ended that practice, restricting enclosure access strictly to working royals engaged in active state service. The mystery was why the master guest list for the upcoming Ascot Royal Enclosure still contained 32 names of extended relatives submitted by the Central Administrative Office 3 weeks prior to the King's formal signature. The mystery resolved when Anne pointed to a digital tablet resting beside her leather gloves and displayed an internal email chain forwarded from the Lord Chamberlain's Deputy Secretary. The email revealed that administrative clerks had deliberately delayed processing the King's draft instructions, hoping to run out the clock before the race meeting commenced. They assumed the traditional guest list would be grandfathered in by default. The facts were that the administrative delay backfired the moment Anne arrived at Windsor Castle with the physical mandate. Armed with the sovereign's direct sign manual, she possessed the legal authority to override every administrative stall tactic employed by the palace bureaucracy. The clerks who attempted to protect extended family privileges were suddenly facing disciplinary review for insubordination. A new mystery opened as Anne noticed a handwritten annotation scribbled in the margin of the printed guest list next to the name of Camilla's sister, who added the annotation requesting a reserved private dining tent adjacent to the central royal box, and when was the special accommodation request approved. Charles shook his head and confirmed that no such accommodation had ever crossed his desk for formal review. The private dining request was an unauthorized perk arranged through internal administrative channels without sovereign consent. Anne picked up the signed parchment mandate, slid it into her leather briefcase, and turned toward the study door. The mandate was locked in, and the cleanup of the royal enclosures was officially underway. The royal enclosure confrontation. Princess Anne stood at the mahogany registration desk inside the main reception pavilion at Ascot Racecourse. She wore a tailored navy wool coat and a matching straw hat pinned firmly to her dark hair. A clipboard rested flat on the polished wooden counter beneath her leather-gloved hands. Two racecourse marshals stood at attention behind the barrier tape a few feet away. Anne lifted the top sheet of the guest manifest and ran her pen down the printed names. The facts are that access to the royal enclosure during major race meetings is governed by strict guest protocols administered by the royal household. While event organizers manage general ticket sales and public admissions, the primary viewing box and surrounding hospitality areas remain under the direct operational control of the sovereign's appointed representatives. When a royal sign manual directive alters admission standards, designated officials possess full legal authority to audit and enforce the updated guest list at the entry gates. Tension filled the registration pavilion as the chief racecourse marshal stepped forward with a worried expression. He pointed to a printed row on the guest manifest. He told Princess Anne that 3 VIP passes had already been issued to extended family members associated with Queen Camilla's domestic circle. He asked if those passes should be honored for the afternoon event, given that the guests were already waiting in the private reception lounge behind the pavilion. The facts were that the 3 VIP passes had been printed 3 days prior under a legacy administrative exemption that the King's new mandate had explicitly revoked. Under the updated protocol, physical passes assigned to non-working relatives were rendered instantly void upon the sovereign's signature. Allowing unauthorized guests into the royal enclosure would directly violate the royal sign manual and undermine the authority of the new governance framework. The mystery was how the extended family members managed to secure printed VIP passes after the King's directive had already been distributed to all departmental coordinators across the palace network. The mystery resolved when the Chief Marshal handed Anne a pink courier slip recovered from the front desk drawer. The slip recorded that an administrative assistant working in the Lord Chamberlain's office had personally driven a batch of emergency guest badges down to the racecourse at midnight, bypassing the standard digital verification queue entirely. The facts were that the late-night drop-off was a deliberate attempt to circumvent the new rules before enforcement officers arrived on site. The administrative staff had relied on traditional loopholes to sneak favored relatives past the security checkpoints before morning audits could begin. A new mystery opened as Anne checked the serial numbers stamped on the bottom of the pink courier slip. She noticed that the serial numbers did not match the official sequence allocated for royal family guests. Who authorized the issuance of counterfeit administrative badges, and which external printing press produced the unauthorized passes? Anne set her pen down on the wooden counter with a sharp tap. She instructed the Chief Marshal to lock the reception pavilion doors immediately and deny entry to everyone currently waiting in the private lounge. The confrontation at the gate was no longer just a seating dispute. It was a direct challenge to royal authority, and Princess Anne was drawing a permanent line in the sand. The heavy glass doors of the pavilion remained sealed against the morning light. Outside, the steady murmur of arriving spectators drifted across the gravel courtyards of the racecourse. Anne walked slowly from the registration counter toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the grandstands. She watched as several private limousines turned into the restricted service lane reserved exclusively for senior royal arrivals. One vehicle stopped near the lower service entrance, and 2 individuals stepped out onto the damp pavement holding printed guest envelopes. The facts are that security clearances for the royal enclosure require strict digital cross-referencing against the central sovereign database. Any manual override or physical paper pass lacking an official holographic seal is automatically flagged as invalid by the computerized checkpoint barriers. When unauthorized personnel attempt to bypass these electronic safeguards using forged credentials, racecourse security teams are legally mandated to detain the individuals pending a formal police inquiry. Tension mounted inside the pavilion as the 2 individuals approached the outer security turnstile, presenting the emerald-tinted envelopes issued by the Clarence House Administrative Annex. The checkpoint guard took the envelopes, scanned the barcodes through the handheld reader, and watched the digital screen flash a bright crimson warning signal. The system rejected the credentials instantly, locking the electronic turnstile mechanism in place. The facts were that the emerald-tinted envelopes were part of an unapproved batch of supplementary invitations, printed outside official channels. These backup passes had been distributed to members of Camilla's extended family to ensure their entry even if the primary guest list was audited. The discovery of these duplicate passes confirmed that an internal network within the household was actively working to subvert the King's direct commands. The mystery was who funded the private printing operation that produced the unauthorized emerald envelopes and forged holographic seals. The mystery resolved when an investigator from Anne's personal oversight team examined the watermark embedded within the heavy paper stock. The watermark matched a specialized stationery supplier used exclusively by the private estate office in Wiltshire. The financial trail led directly back to accounts managed under the supervision of Camilla's inner domestic circle. The facts were that the production of forged credentials constituted a severe breach of administrative protocols and a potential criminal offense under forgery statutes. The attempt to bypass the sovereign's mandate had crossed the line from a simple family disagreement into a deliberate act of institutional subversion. A new mystery opened as Anne noticed a handwritten note tucked inside the rejected envelope. The note contained a specific telephone number and a terse instruction directing the holders to contact a senior private secretary if stopped at the gate, whose private extension was listed on the paper, and how deep did the conspiracy reach within the core administrative staff. Anne handed the note to her lead security officer and instructed him to trace the phone number immediately. The operation at the racecourse gates was holding firm, and the web of internal manipulation was unraveling thread by thread. Princess Anne turned back toward the main entrance, ready to face whatever resistance remained. The sovereign's direct order. King Charles stood by the tall arched window in his private sitting room at Buckingham Palace. He wore a dark blue business suit with a pale blue silk tie. His hands rested on the polished wooden windowsill as he watched a gray rain shower sweep across the inner courtyard below. A silver bell sat on the mahogany side table near his elbow. The room was quiet except for the muffled ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway outside. The facts are that the reigning monarch holds ultimate constitutional authority over the internal organization, operational rules, and guest allocation policies of all royal residences and state enclosures, while day-to-day administrative tasks are managed by appointed household departments. The sovereign can issue binding orders that override existing departmental guidelines. When institutional integrity is threatened by unauthorized privilege, a direct royal order serves as the supreme legal instrument to enforce compliance across all working branches of the monarchy. Tension filled the private sitting room as the door swung open and the Lord Chamberlain stepped inside. He carried a heavy leather portfolio tucked under his left arm. He walked toward the desk and stopped 2 paces away from the sovereign. He did not look up immediately. He told the king that several departmental heads had formally petitioned for a grace period before implementing the new seating restrictions at upcoming national events. The facts were that the petition was an informal attempt by entrenched bureaucrats to dilute the impact of the king's recent signed manual directive. For decades, senior administrative officials had operated with virtual autonomy, carving out custom privileges for extended family networks and social associates. The sudden enforcement of a strict working royals-only policy threatened to dismantle the informal patronage systems that these officials had built and maintained over many years. The mystery was why the Lord Chamberlain chose to personally deliver the petition instead of routing the administrative request through the standard interoffice memo system used by palace staff. The mystery resolved when the king picked up the silver bell from the side table and set it down with a sharp, echoing ring. He told the Lord Chamberlain that no grace periods would be granted under any circumstances. He added that any department head who failed to implement the updated enclosure rules within 24 hours would face immediate suspension for gross administrative negligence. The facts were that the sovereign's firm stance completely closed the bureaucratic loophole the officials were trying to exploit. The direct order left no room for interpretation, negotiation, or delay. The administrative resistance crumbled the moment the king made it clear that institutional survival took precedence over personal comfort and social convention. A new mystery opened as the Lord Chamberlain pulled a single sheet of yellow paper from his leather portfolio and laid it on the desk. The paper contained a list of 3 departmental directors who had signed the petition alongside a hidden signature block that had been hastily crossed out with black ink. Whose signature was hastily scratched out at the bottom of the petition, and why was that person's identity considered too sensitive for the formal administrative record? The king looked down at the crossed-out signature, but did not touch the paper. He told the Lord Chamberlain to hand the yellow sheet directly to Princess Anne's legal team for immediate forensic review. The sovereign's direct order had cleared away the smoke of bureaucratic defiance, exposing the remaining weak points in the household administration. the institutional cleanup was moving from policy formulation down to absolute enforcement. The Lord Chamberlain took a slow step backward from the mahogany desk. He closed his leather portfolio with a dull thud that echoed against the high plaster ceiling. Outside the tall windows, the rain shower began to clear, leaving the slate roofs of the palace glistening under the pale afternoon sun. The sovereign remained standing by the glass, his gaze fixed on the flags flying above the inner quadrangle. Every department head within the royal household now knew that the rules had changed permanently. The facts are that structural reform within the monarchy requires unbroken solidarity between the reigning sovereign and senior working royals. When internal administrators attempt to protect entrenched privileges through passive resistance, the monarch must assert direct executive command. The issuance of the Sign Manual Directive marked a historic shift away from traditional patronage and toward strict public accountability for every individual granted access to royal spaces. Tension lingered in the room as the Lord Chamberlain hesitated near the exit. He asked if the new restrictions would apply retroactively to permanent residential leases held by non-working relatives across Crown properties. The question hung in the air like a heavy physical weight. King Charles turned slowly from the window and met the official's gaze without blinking. He replied that all residential occupancy agreements tied to the royal estates would be subject to the same rigorous audit. The facts were that residential privileges granted to extended family members had long operated outside standard property laws. Several non-working relatives occupied grace and favor apartments across Windsor, Kensington, and St. James's, without paying market rent or contributing to maintenance costs. The inclusion of residential leases in the new audit signaled a total dismantling of the extended family welfare system that had persisted for generations. The mystery was how dozens of extended family members managed to secure permanent residency agreements inside royal palaces without formal parliamentary approval or public record filings. The mystery resolved when the Lord Chamberlain admitted that historical tenancy exemptions had been rubber-stamped by low-level administrative committees using outdated royal household bylaws dating back to the mid-20th century. These internal bylaws allowed senior officials to bypass public scrutiny entirely when granting housing to personal friends and relatives. The facts are that those obsolete bylaws were formally revoked the moment the king signed the new administrative code. The legal foundation supporting the extended family's housing arrangements evaporated instantly, turning indefinite occupancy into temporary tenancy subject to annual sovereign review. A new mystery opened as the Lord Chamberlain retrieved a secondary ledger from his briefcase. The ledger contained a list of 12 residential apartments currently occupied by non-working relatives who had received private financial subsidies from the sovereign grant. Which specific individuals were receiving public funds to cover their private utility and security costs? King Charles instructed the Lord Chamberlain to place the residency ledger on the desk alongside the yellow petition sheet. He informed him that Princess Anne would review the housing allocations during her morning inspection rounds at Windsor. The systemic overhaul of the royal household was expanding beyond ceremonial seating charts into the very foundation of palace real estate management. The banning of Camilla's relatives, Princess Anne walked down the long carpeted corridor of the residential annex at St. James's Palace. She wore a dark woolen skirt and carried a clipboard filled with printed eviction notices. Her boots made a sharp clicking sound against the polished parquet floor. 2 palace security officers followed 2 steps behind her in absolute silence. She stopped in front of apartment 4 and raised her right hand to knock firmly on the wooden paneling. The facts are that grace and favor apartments maintained within royal palaces are granted exclusively under the personal discretion of the reigning sovereign for individuals actively serving the crown. When non-working relatives or extended family members occupy these historic properties without performing official state duties, their tenancy violates the core principles governing public estate allocations. The newly enacted sovereign directive empowers designated royal officials to reclaim these residential units and reassign them to active working personnel. Tension filled the quiet hallway as the heavy oak door of apartment 4 swung open. A middle-aged woman wearing a silk dressing gown looked out with an expression of profound irritation. She recognized Princess Anne immediately and attempted to block the doorway with her shoulder. She demanded to know why security personnel were standing outside her private residence without prior warning, Anne did not step back or lower her clipboard. She held out a formal eviction notice bearing the royal seal and told the woman that her residential occupancy agreement had been revoked effective immediately. The facts were that the woman standing in the doorway was Camilla's cousin, who had occupied the 4-bedroom palace apartment rent-free for over 15 years. During that entire period, all utility bills, council taxes, and structural maintenance costs had been billed directly to the sovereign grant. Public records showed that hundreds of thousands of pounds in taxpayer funds had been utilized to maintain a private residence for an individual holding no official constitutional or ceremonial role within the royal family. The mystery was how an extended family member with zero official state responsibilities managed to secure a lifetime lease on prime central London palace real estate without public disclosure or parliamentary review. The mystery resolved when Anne pointed to a specific paragraph on the legal notice. The paragraph cited an internal administrative memo signed in 1998 by a compromised junior comptroller. That memo had bypassed the standard property board approval process entirely, slipping the residential lease into a back channel reserved for emergency household staff housing. The facts were that the 1998 loophole had been exploited for decades to shelter dozens of non-working relatives inside Crown properties across London and Windsor. The current eviction sweep was systematically closing every single one of those back channels, returning valuable state assets to direct institutional control. A new mystery opened as Anne noticed a stack of cardboard moving boxes piled high in the apartment's front foyer. The boxes were taped shut and labeled with shipping destinations, heading straight to a private country estate in Wiltshire. Who packed the moving boxes before the eviction notice was formally served? And who leaked the confidential housing audit to Camilla's family circle 24 hours before Anne's arrival? Anne stepped past the occupant into the foyer and picked up a shipping label from the top box. The label listed a private freight forwarding company owned by the same corporate shell entity involved in the Jubilee brooch diversion scheme. The residential clearance was not just an administrative eviction, it was an emergency asset removal operation designed to hide private property before investigators could inspect the premises. Anne instructed the security officers to secure the apartment exits and contact the High Court enforcement team to impound the packed moving boxes. The systematic removal of Camilla's relatives from royal residences was exposing a deeper network of concealment. Princess Anne turned back toward the hallway, ready to deliver the next eviction notice down the corridor, the historical precedent of royal exclusion. A heavy iron key turned slowly inside the brass lock of the muniment room at Windsor Castle. An archivist in a dark gray waistcoat pushed open the heavy oak door. He stepped inside and switched on the overhead brass lights. Rows of tall wooden shelving units stretched down the length of the secure archive vault. The shelves held hundreds of leather-bound historical folios dating back to the reign of King George III. The air inside the room was cool, smelling faintly of dried parchment, old leather, and beeswax. The facts are that historical precedents for royal exclusion and asset reclamation are thoroughly documented in parliamentary rolls and royal warrant archives spanning over 2 centuries. When extended family members or non-working relatives attempt to misappropriate state resources or bypass palace governance, reigning monarchs possess established common law powers to strip them of privileges and residences. These historical actions do not require parliamentary approval when executed under the direct royal prerogative concerning household administration. Tension filled the quiet archive vault as Princess Anne walked through the open doorway. She wore a dark blue tweed suit and carried a small leather notebook. She stopped in front of the archivist's desk and asked him to retrieve the 19th century royal warrant register for 1845. The archivist turned quickly, walked down the second aisle, and pulled a heavy volume bound in red calfskin from the third shelf. He carried it back to the desk and laid it flat on the green felt surface. The facts were that the 1845 register recorded a major institutional crisis during the reign of Queen Victoria. Several extended relatives had attempted to claim permanent residential rights over state-owned properties in Berkshire and Surrey. Queen Victoria issued a direct royal proclamation revoking all grace and favor privileges held by non-working family members, establishing the ironclad legal precedent that palace accommodations exist exclusively to serve active agents of the crown. The mystery was why 19th century legal precedents regarding royal exclusion had been deliberately omitted from the modern administrative training manuals distributed to palace staff over the past 3 decades. The mystery resolved when the archivist pointed to a handwritten marginal note scrawled in the 1845 register by a Victorian Lord Chancellor. The note explained that late 20th century administrative directors had quietly suppressed the historical precedents to protect the growing network of non-working relatives who had embedded themselves within the royal household infrastructure. The facts were that this institutional cover-up allowed extended family members to operate unchecked for decades, accumulating private wealth and securing grace and favor housing under the radar of public accountability. The suppression of historical bylaws created a false sense of permanent entitlement among non-working relatives who assumed their privileges were legally untouchable. A new mystery opened as Anne turned to the final page of the red calfskin volume. The page contained a list of 3 historical family estates that had been forcibly repossessed by the Crown following the 1845 decree. Which of those 3 historical properties matched the legal description of the Gloucestershire manor currently occupied by Camilla's sister? Anne traced her gloved finger down the faded ink lines of the register. The second property listed on the repossession schedule shared the exact parish boundaries, Crown land grants, and historical survey numbers as the modern Gloucestershire estate. The land had originally been leased to extended relatives under a temporary 19th century exemption that was never formally renewed by Parliament. The current eviction sweep was not just a modern housekeeping exercise. It was the formal execution of a century-old royal repossession order. The archivist closed the red calfskin volume with a soft, resonant thud. The historical precedent was crystal clear, providing an unanswerable legal justification for the ongoing removal of extended family members from all royal properties. Anne picked up her leather notebook and turned toward the vault exit. The past had laid out the exact playbook for institutional survival, and Princess Anne was executing every single directive with absolute historic authority. The heavy iron door of the muniment room clicked shut behind Princess Anne as she walked back out into the vaulted limestone corridor. The stone walls absorbed the sound of her footsteps, muffling the echo as she moved toward the main administrative staircase. She descended 2 flights of stairs to the ground-level records office, where a team of High Court forensic auditors was reviewing 19th century property deeds and tax exemption filings. The natural light from the high courtyard windows cast long beams across the wooden work tables. The facts are that statutory enforcement of royal property rights relies on continuous archival verification. When historical leases and land grants are challenged in modern civil courts, government lawyers must present unbroken documentary evidence proving that the Crown retained ultimate reversionary interest in the contested estates. Without these original parchment documents, unauthorized occupants could exploit legal loopholes to claim adverse possession or permanent tenancy rights under modern property statutes. Tension filled the records office as senior auditor Marcus Vance stood up from his desk and walked over to meet Anne. He laid a large rolled parchment map across the center work table and anchored the 4 corners with brass paperweights. He told Anne that the 19th century survey maps confirmed that the Gloucestershire Manor House was built on land originally designated as Royal Hunting Forest, exempt from municipal taxation. He added that the exemption expired automatically upon the death of the original 19th century leaseholder. The facts were that Camilla's family had continued to claim the historic tax exemption for over 40 years without submitting the required renewal applications to the Crown Estate Commissioners. This administrative omission constituted a breach of tenancy conditions, rendering the current occupancy completely unlawful under ancient land tenure laws. The discovery of the expired exemption removed the final legal barrier, preventing the immediate repossession of the estate. The mystery was how the family managed to renew the property tax exemptions through the local council every 5 years, without alerting the Central Crown Estate Office in London. The mystery resolved when Vance pointed to a series of forged municipal audit stamps pressed into the back of the parchment map. A corrupt local tax official had manually altered the municipal registry records in 1992, coding the private estate as an active agricultural research station rather than a residential royal property. The facts were that the fraudulent coding shielded the estate from routine national audits and diverted millions of pounds in local property taxes away from the public treasury. The the network of protection extended far beyond the palace walls, incorporating local government officials who were willing to manipulate municipal records to safeguard the private interests of the extended royal family. A new mystery opened as Anne examined a small wax seal stamped onto the corner of the forged registry document, whose personal signet was used to authorize the municipal code alteration. And did that individual hold an official position within the sovereign's household at the time? Vance shook his head, explaining that the wax seal belonged to a disgraced former Treasury Secretary who resigned suddenly in 1993 amid unrelated financial scandals. The tentacles of corruption ran deep into the heart of the British financial establishment, linking political operatives with palace insiders in a systematic effort to siphon public assets. Anne instructed Vance to package the parchment map and the municipal registry files for immediate presentation to the Parliamentary Oversight Committee. The historical precedent had not only justified the current evictions, it had exposed a multi-decade administrative conspiracy that subverted the laws of the realm. The muniment room research was complete, and the evidence was ready to be deployed on the national stage. A unified front for the monarchy. Prince William stood at the head of the long oak conference table in the private state rooms at Buckingham Palace. He wore a dark navy business suit and a crisp white shirt with an open collar. Princess Catherine sat to his right, reviewing a fresh set of legal briefs bound in black leather. Princess Anne walked through the double doors at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, carrying a heavy brown leather folder under her arm. She pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table and sat down without a word. The facts are that institutional survival during a constitutional crisis requires absolute operational alignment among senior working members of the royal family. When internal corruption and asset diversion threaten public trust, fragmented responses allow rogue factions to exploit bureaucratic loopholes. A unified front between the Prince of Wales, the Princess of Wales, and Princess Royal creates an impenetrable command structure that neutralizes internal opposition and restores rigorous public accountability across all Crown operations. Tension filled the quiet conference room as Princess Anne opened her brown leather folder and slid 3 documents across the polished table toward William and Catherine. She told them that the final round of residential clearances at St. James's Palace had been successfully completed 20 minutes prior. She added that all non-working relatives had vacated their grace and favor apartments, and the locks had been changed under the direct supervision of High Court bailiffs. The facts were that the removal of extended family members from Crown properties marked the first time in over half a century that royal real estate guidelines had been enforced without exception. For decades, informal exemptions had allowed non-working relatives to live rent-free in prime London locations, while public funds covered their utility and maintenance expenses. The joint enforcement action led by Anne, backed by William and Catherine, permanently dismantled that private welfare system. The mystery was how the keys to the final remaining residential unit had mysteriously vanished from the estate manager's office 20 minutes before the eviction team arrived. The mystery resolved when Catherine pointed to a security log printout recovered from the building's digital entrance gate. The log recorded that a junior administrative clerk had entered the manager's office at 8 o'clock and removed the key ring before exiting through a service stairwell. Security guards intercepted the clerk near the inner courtyard gate, recovering the missing keys before they could be handed off to an external courier. The facts were that the attempted theft of the keys was the last desperate maneuver by entrenched administrative staff attempting to sabotage the housing audit. The swift intervention of palace security thwarted the cover-up, ensuring that the repossession process proceeded without further disruption or delay. A new mystery opened as William examined a small electronic key fob attached to the recovered key ring. The device did not match any standard lock mechanism used within the palace residential annex. Whose private subterranean storage vault did the electronic fob open, and what classified documents were hidden beneath the floorboards of the basement level? Anne instructed her lead security detail to take the electronic key fob down to the basement archive for immediate testing. The unified leadership of the royal family had broken through the final layers of administrative resistance, securing every physical asset and restoring total control to the active Crown administration. The modern monarchy was standing firm against corruption, proving that public duty superseded private privilege at every level of the institution. Princess Anne's uncompromising enforcement of royal protocols has permanently reclaimed the institution from private entitlement. By stripping unauthorized guests from the royal enclosure and evicting non-working relatives from historic estates, Anne, alongside William and Catherine, has restored true accountability to the crown. With the king's explicit backing, this historic cleanup proves that public duty always outranks family privilege. Will these bold reforms heal the monarchy's standing with the public forever?